Welcome to Cornerstone's Walking in the World equipping class. I'm Matt, and with me I've got Scott.
Hello.
I also have with me Brian.
Hey.
And what we're doing in this class is we're teaching you how to live the basic Christian life. This class is built around the discipleship pathway, and we have just completed the mission category of the discipleship pathway, and this is our first session exploring the calling category, the unique roles and responsibilities that God has given you in your life. And here's what we're going to talk about in this session: how calling is a part of spreading God's glory. We're going to get an overview of what calling looks like, and we'll talk about one of our major callings in life, work. And so let's start off like this. Calling is a word that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, and it's used a lot of different ways in our culture, in our society, in our world. But what are we talking about when we use the word calling?
I think for Christians, it's very common to think that only pastors or missionaries have a calling from God. And so we talk about, the missionary being called to the mission field or the pastor being called into the ministry, which kind of leaves everyone else sort of not called. And that can be a really common way of using the word. But the Bible doesn't limit calling to just a certain subset of jobs that people can have that happen to be in some sort of paid ministry. In fact, the Bible would say that all work and all areas of life as well are a part of calling. And you see that even in the very beginning of the Bible. So in Genesis 1, where it says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. It goes on and it says, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And from there, you get the sense that God's creating man in his own image, so we're built to reflect then what God is like through the way we live in the world he made. And right after that, God calls the man and woman to fill the earth and subdue it. And so there's this calling that we have to sort of
The outdoorsman?
The outdoorsman. You've got to go outside, to do this. No, you don't. This is the idea of filling the world with God's reflection. If we're in his image, we fill the world with his reflection as we grow in numbers. And as that happens and we sort of begin to cover the earth, we cultivate these different areas of life in the world. And so as the earth is filled, each human being has an opportunity to then obey God's calling in their various relationships or jobs or families or sort of societal roles. And so as you keep reading, you see, sin does twist God's reflection and ruins a lot of those areas of human life. But redemption in Jesus allows us then to follow God's call by the power of the Holy Spirit. And therefore, as a Christian, you don't just sort of happen to work a job, have a family, live in a neighborhood, and some, small number of us are called into ministry. Everyone has a calling in these various areas of their life.
So basically, any societal role that you play, any responsibility in your life, anything that you have care over, those are all areas and different components of your life that you are called by God to really reflect that image of God in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, we spent most of this particular class learning how to love Christians, that was community, how to love non-Christians, that was mission. But when we talk about walking in the world, we're also talking about displaying God's glory in the way we live and the way we structure our lives in the way that God has placed us in these unique roles and responsibilities in our neighborhoods, in our families, in various other ways as well. And so basically what we're saying when we use the word calling is that calling is where we spread and display the glory of God alongside of community and mission.
So that's what calling is. But let's move on to how we pursue our callings.
Well, I think that as we do that, we need to be careful because I think when we think about our callings, I think we tend to think of it in kind of a mystical way, right? There's all sorts of different ideas of trying to figure out what your calling is or where you're calling. You just know that one thing that God's given you to do, with your life. And I think oftentimes people think about maybe it's their vocation as a calling, maybe it's a certain relationship, right? As parenting, as their calling. And I think when we think about it in that kind of mystical sense, people also tend to assume that they only have one calling. Right? That there's just one thing that they have to figure it out and they have to go find it.
It's the calling.
It's the calling, exactly. And if they, and oftentimes actually I think this is why most people struggle so much with these concepts because they feel like they haven't found it, or they've missed it, or they know what it is and they're not able to do it. Right? Maybe they're not freed up to do, like they have to, put bread on the table and take care of their kids and take care of their parents, and so that like limits them from doing the thing that they think is their calling. But the reality is that, I mean, as you talked about, Brian, calling is what God has tasked us with cultivating, which means there's multiple callings that God has for our lives. So instead of looking at one just gigantic thing that God wants us to accomplish, or even just one area that he wants us to invest in, I think we need to look at the various roles and responsibilities that he has put us into in our lives. I think I really don't think you identify your calling by, going up on a mountain for like a week and fasting and meditating. Like, you find your calling by, in the midst of your life, just stopping and looking around, right? Who are the people? What are the roles? What are the responsibilities the Lord has given you to? What are the roles that where you are, you ought to be pursuing? Maybe it's not a responsibility or a role you have now, but it's one that you ought to be pursuing. But there's no need to search inside for that one special calling. Instead, we're called to look around us to see the people that God's called us to serve, and the ways God has called us to serve.
Yeah, in that way, it ties back to love again. I mean, I think when we talk about this particular class, we're talking about the second half of the greatest commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. We've seen that in community and mission. And when Jesus explains that, in the book of Luke, immediately someone sort of shoots their hand up and says, "Well, who's my neighbor?" And he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, this sense that, there's no one excluded from this Christ-like love that we're supposed to give to other people. And in a way, like, those different callings that you just mentioned are just different ways of answering the question, who's my neighbor? And so it could be, there's a way that it can be very obvious that I'm supposed to love, my, maybe a spouse or a parent or a friend or something like that. That's very, very clear. But it might not be obvious that we're supposed to love, like, our employer, or our local city council. Like, there's ways that who is my neighbor? That question gets answered not just in this set of individuals that happen to be obvious to you that you should love, but also in the various other neighbors that God has put into our lives that we're supposed to love, not just interpersonally, though that's true, but also in the way we organize our lives, the way we structure how we live with them, how we go about our jobs and life in our neighborhoods and things like that. And so you have like the same ability then to use the paradigm that we've been using so far, this love paradigm that you have in your notes again, where loving your neighbor looks like knowing, serving, speaking, and gospeling. And at that level, what you end up having is this idea of manifesting the same kind of love that we've learned about for community and mission into these new arenas where God has given us unique roles and responsibilities and wants us to love our neighbor as ourselves.
So let's kind of take a minute and flesh that out a little bit. One of your callings might be, as we mentioned, you might be an employee. So what might it look like to know, serve, speak, and gospel the company that employs you? Because I think this is kind of like you said, Brian, it's a little more obvious when you're talking about certain roles or certain relationships you have. And let's talk kind of like, what does it look like? What does that mean for us to do that, or with other callings, with family or community as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in every context, I think that it begins with treating people like people. I think in our kind of industrialized and structured context with a lot of our different jobs, I think that the temptation is to like treat people just like cogs, like just like a role. So I think it begins with treating people like people. But then it also, I think, looks at the ways that your job or your employer provides a service to other people, right? It's looking at the big picture of what you're contributing to as well. And as we do both of those things, we both on a micro scale with the individuals around us, and on a macro scale as we contribute to the blessing of others through our vocation, whether it's designing a video game for them, or serving them as a nurse and caring for them, or a school teacher, or an artist, or whatever the vocation might be. I think it begins by helping us see that if we see people as people, then we're not evaluating them. We're not trying to use people to take advantage of them, right? We're not trying to get one up on them. We're not trying to just use them to the end, but we're treating them like people. We don't simply evaluate them based on whether or not they help or get in the way of our goal, but we're called to love them. And I think, and in the workplace, I think that shapes. First of all, it shapes how you interact with people. Second of all, I think it also shapes how you hire and let go of people, right? As you seek the best for the company and the best for them and the best for your coworkers and the best for this team, that doesn't mean that you never fire somebody, right? But you do so differently, right? Because they're not simply expendable tools, right? You view them as people, and like any parent with a child, like sometimes you let someone go because that's what's best for them and best for the company. But you do so recognizing them as a person in a much, much deeper and richer way. And so, I think that means practically taking time to really get to know people. I think it means caring about them, actually serving them, doing them good, not always trying to get away with the least you can do, or begrudging when you have to pick up slack for someone else, right? But seeing all these as opportunities to serve people. And it means, taking opportunities to speak truth to them when that's appropriate as well. And so, I think it can look like that in our workplace. I think, like you mentioned, in our homes. These categories ought to shape the relationships you have with your roommate. They ought to shape the relationships you have with your spouse. They ought to shape the relationships you have with your children, right? You start by how do you parent? Well, you parent by knowing your kids and serving them and speaking truth to them and gospeling them. I think you live with your spouse in the same way, and you live in your apartment building or in your neighborhood the same way as you seek to, in ways that are appropriate to those relationships, love others as well.
And there's a broader kind of application in the midst of all that where you end up, there's a way that you're not just trying to know the individuals around you at work, you're trying to know your work. You're trying to know your company. You're trying to know how the whole thing works. You're studying it. You're being aware of the interactions that happen and why people do what they do and how this whole thing fits. And you're serving that larger dynamic as well. You're speaking to that larger dynamic in the midst of all this. And even with your family, there's a way that the individuals in your family, you can know them individually. There's also a way of loving the family unit by paying attention to how all that comes together in these various interactions. So knowing that, serving the family as a whole. There's ways that this kind of can blow up into larger groups of people that you're loving by seeing them not just as a bunch of individuals, but also how they all interact together as a group.
Yeah, and I know we're about to dive into looking specifically at work, but since we're already there in a sense, it seems like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because it seems like that means that you need to understand how all these pieces work together maybe in a company, what your part is in it, and in one way or another be bought into the end result that you all together are producing, right? So work becomes more than, I think sometimes we think of a calling as work because it provides a paycheck, and I'm not saying that it has to be our dream or the ultimate goal for is what the company's doing, but at some level we have to recognize that we are working together for a purpose, and that's a part of the calling I'm fulfilling.
Yeah, we will talk about more of the goal side or the production, the service of what you do. The things that you do at work are a means of loving your neighbor in that direct sense. But I agree. I think there is a sense in which you're trying to say, I am not just around a bunch of individuals that I interact with in these sort of siloed fashions where it's just, well, now I'm talking with Jim and now I'm talking with Sue, and that never matters. When you get into a company, when you get into an organization, when you get into a neighborhood or an apartment complex or a country or all these different things, you find yourself in the midst of these really complicated interactions where you're able to say, if I really want to love my neighbor as myself, I need to love them as an individual person. And I also need to care enough to try and figure out how we're all caught up in this community that's bigger than us, whether that's at work or that's in your neighborhood or different things like that.
Oh, well, that's great and helpful, and it's a perfect segue into what we're going to be talking about through the rest of the class, which is one of the most significant callings that people have that we will be talking about with work. And so, Brian, can you kick us off on work?
Sure. Work is something obviously very close to a lot of people's hearts, in as much as it takes a lot of their time. And so whether you love your work or you don't like your work, it tends to affect you really, really deeply. And when we talk about work, what we're talking about is not just necessarily your job that you work kind of 9 to 5. It doesn't have to look a certain way. Your work is really wherever you're spending the majority of your mental and physical energy. And so we want to make sure you broaden it out, because just because you're retired, in a sense, doesn't mean you don't work anymore. And obviously that gets a little complicated as it touches different areas of calling and things like that.
We've used the word vocation before.
Yeah, and that which is just this Latin word that means sort of calling, but it helps because that idea of vocation kind of has that blend of the idea of where you work, but not just necessarily your job. Because some people, in that sense, you can not be employed by a company. You can spend most of your time, an easy example is raising kids. That's your work, because it's where you're spending most of your physical and mental energy. And with something like that demands that kind of attention, you tend to have false views of that thing crop up. And so typically you can either look at your work as an evil or an idol. Those are kind of the two typical wrong ways people look at their work. And work on that one side then it can be viewed as like a necessary evil. So here, like, you think of your work and like, that's the thing getting in the way of my life. So like, whether it's it's getting in the way of family or pleasure or freedom or something else along those lines, your life revolves around like what you can do when you're not at work. And so in your ideal world, you'd be able to have enough food and money and all these things and never have to work again, so you could go live your real life, the life you really want to do.
The life you're called to.
Yeah, in that sense. And so this is kind of the view that drives people who want to get rich young or retire really young or those kind of things. Work just kind of gets in the way of what you want to do. So it's a necessary evil. You have to do it, but it's an evil. And then on the other side, work can become like a necessary identity. And we see that a lot in Los Angeles too, where work isn't getting in the way of your life. Here, work is your life. And so like family or pleasure or freedom or whatever, that all revolves around what you do at your job. And so in your ideal world, you wouldn't not work. You'd be like the best at work. You'd be the greatest of all time at your career, and everyone would know it, and you'd be super successful. And that's usually the view of work that ends up driving people who want to like leave a mark in the industry, or they're very driven because the work that they do, where they spend that time, becomes who they are.
Have you guys seen people experience this at work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of ways that most people I know experience one or both of these, if not actually constantly swing back and forth between
evil and idol.
Between evil and idol, yeah. Like, and I mean, and even just another way to like practically think about evil, right? We've talked about it previously as viewing it as an inconvenience, right? Like it's that thing that's in the way, right? It's that, and the reason it's evil is because it's in the way of what you really should be doing or really want to be doing. And by I mean, sometimes that swinging back and forth takes place during, between like different seasons in life, right? Like it's your idol, and then all of a sudden you have a couple of kids, and now it's an evil that's in the way of what you think's really important. But I think actually for most people, I don't know, maybe that's an overstatement, but I think for a lot of people, this is gonna swing back and forth in the same day, right? Like it's an idol most of the day, and then you're driving home, and on your drive home, it like morphs into an evil. It morphs into an inconvenience. Like, I can't believe it kept me home this late. Like now, like my brain has switched from thinking about all the things and all the pressure and the performance and things like that during the day, where that really has caused me to idolize it. And now I'm like shifting my mind to my family, and all of a sudden I'm thinking about like my kids, and I haven't seen them at all today, and they're going to be in bed by the time I get home. All of a sudden it's an evil, right? And
you almost feel guilty and angry at it for it.
Yeah, and it's an evil, like the whole drive home, it's an evil, like, and then all of a sudden you get an email and you check it on your phone and it's an idol again. Right? Like, so I mean, I think that I think that the reason people switch back and forth between this so much is because they think that these are the only two options. Right? I mean, and because I think a lot of work, especially, I mean, this is true in different parts of the world and in different parts of the country, but especially where we live, work demands idolatry. Like it at least desires that. It's like we want your all.
Praises
it. Praises it. Yeah. And I think like it wants your all. It wants, it doesn't require it, but it definitely like praises it and draws you into that. And so I think it's particularly hard. And so I think because of that, we flip back and forth, thinking that there's only two options, like not knowing that there's a way to walk forward. There's a way to think about work that isn't what we got handed. And there's a way to think about it in relation to all the other callings and responsibilities we have. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be evil or an idol. Like we can navigate this as a calling that gives it appropriate weight, but also fits in with all the other various callings that the Lord has given to us.
So those are the ways we oftentimes misunderstand and view work incorrectly. How should we view work then, Brian?
I think Scott hits on it, and in a lot of ways, this is the theme throughout the rest of this category of calling, is that the way to view these things is as a calling, not an identity that makes you who you are, but not an inconvenience that gets in the way of who you are. Who you are is grounded in Christ. And God, through Jesus Christ, by the power of the Holy Spirit, has put you in these positions, these unique roles and responsibilities that are means by which you can love your neighbor as yourself. And so you get freed up from the chains that tie you to your work as a way to sort of earn your selfhood, earn your worth, earn your identity. And also free from the chains that make most of where you spend your time and your day an inconvenience to you and something you don't want to do. It becomes a manifestation of love. And I think one of the best ways that this has been understood came from Martin Luther. And when you look at Psalm 136, verse 25, it says, it's God who gives food to all flesh, for his steadfast love endures forever. And that actually shows up in various parts of the Psalms and the Bible, the idea of God giving daily bread, the idea of God giving food to all flesh. And he read that verse, Martin Luther did, and he kind of asked himself, like, well, how? Like, how does God give food to all flesh? And he realized, well, there was a time when it's like manna from heaven, but that's not how he does it now. And his answer was like, well, it's through everyone's work. Like, so the farmer works to grow the food. These days the truck driver, works to get the food somewhere.
No truck drivers in Martin Luther's day.
Not so much, no. There were different modes of transportation.
Horse and carriage.
But just as much work. And the grocer, he's working to sell the food. And then, you come to today and you realize how pervasive this gets. So like you got to talk about the manufacturers that make the farmer's tractor and the trucker's vehicle and the real estate agent who locates the space for the grocer and like the person who did the code for the website for the real estate agent. At some point, it really fleshes itself out to show that your work, no matter how indirectly, is a way of loving and serving others. It's a way that God provides for other people. And so that's a pretty fascinating way to understand your work. That's not an idol. It's not an inconvenience. It's a way that God provides for people through the things you do day to day.
There's so much hope and so much power in understanding this biblically. I think it's really helpful just even hearing that and being reminded of it, even myself thinking through life and thinking through work. There's just so much power in that truth. So let's take a quick look at how the Bible kind of guides this calling. Brian, will you lead us through that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the best places to go to talk about this, and this happens with a lot of the callings, I think all of the callings actually, you have this understanding that this role or responsibility is a calling, and that's in a sense a first step. And then you can go through Scripture and find places where it addresses that particular role or responsibility and gives you like deeper, further principles for how you can be someone who loves your neighbor as yourself in this role or in this responsibility. And one of the best places to do that for work, for this kind of vocation, is in Colossians chapter 3, towards the end of chapter 3 and the very beginning of chapter 4. So I'll read it, verses 3:22 through 4:1 of Colossians. And Paul says, bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You're serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Now, as you look through this, obviously it's a different situation in the Old Testament, but the principles in it are the same. And what you have is this situation where you have in a sense, someone, if you're doing work every day, typically you do work for someone. There's someone who is directly over you that you're sort of accountable to. And for a lot of people, there's also people that are accountable to you in the workplace in some way, shape, or form. And so from this passage, we can draw out principles that show us when you're someone who spends your work day both underneath someone else's authority and in authority over other people, what does that look like? And so asking you guys, looking at this passage, like what are some principles about work that you see just coming out of this passage?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the first thing that he says is obey, right? There's a sense of a dutiful obedience or a listening to those who are over you, in charge of you in a work environment, that there's a responsibility we have to not just do whatever we want. There's no freedom to say, I'm going to do whatever I want. It's my job. I'll do whatever I want. And it doesn't matter what my bosses tell me. We oftentimes have some sort of friction or something with bosses at different points, but that there's kind of this fundamental responsibility that we have as an employee to listen to and do what the job that was designed for us and required for us to do from our bosses tells us to do.
Which you're freed from, in a sense, by understanding this as a calling. So like
Right.
you do that typically when it's an inconvenience. When it's an inconvenience, you tend to rebel against any little thing that makes it more of an inconvenience, and you already start kind of in the red. But when you're free to see this as a means of loving others, it really does open you up to be able to say, yeah, I want to help. I want to be someone who's helpful here.
Yeah, and I think that there's like this overarching principle, right? That I think is kind of exactly what we're getting at and what everything derives from, which is simply the fact that God is ultimately the authority, right? That you work not just to please your earthly authority, that you don't do it for eye service, like he says, or as a people pleaser, but with a sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord, right? Whatever you do, work heartily, right? So work hard as for the Lord and not for men. And so there's this recognition that no matter what you do, like whatever your vocation is, that the ultimate authority and the one who you're working for and the one whose work ethic you should both seek to emulate and the one whose work ethic you kind of come under is the Lord's, not your temporary boss. And I think so much of the time, so many both just kind of excuses and complaints come from the fact that we have fallen bosses, right? Like we kind of wish that the people that we worked under were smarter or wiser or could do this or could do that, but they're not. They're fallen, and sometimes I think that can either justify our bitterness or justify cutting corners or things like that. But really, ultimately, we're seeking to work for God, which is a principle that applies no matter if you're like in middle management and have like a bunch of people above you and a bunch of people below you. Doesn't matter if you're an independent artist. You're still working for God. If you're a stay-at-home mom, if you're a CEO, like all of these different roles, in each one of them, they have the same, ultimately, authority, which is God, and they're called to work for Him.
And that produces, I think, from this passage, it seems clear that produces a kind of attitude towards that work as a calling, where you're serving and working for the Lord in a way that means you can't be lazy or can't cut corners, right? You're working heartily because you're working for your Lord. It means that you're not just going to do something so that you look good, but you're actually not really doing the job properly. That would be the people pleasing, right? If God is the one you're working for, God sees everything. Like who you tricking, right? By acting this kind of way. So having that kind of mentality, I think radically changes your posture towards work in a way that sees it as a calling, and then you live it out in these ways that this passage specifically talks about.
Yeah, I find that work heartily phrase to be really, really powerful, especially when it's a very good translation. It means what it means, but if you try to get really literal with that translation, it would say you're working from your soul. And I think that sense of like not heartily in the sense of, well, you're just working hard, but you're working from your soul in the sense that there's an internal drive for you to be at this work and see it as a means that's not just a means of loving others. It's not just because your boss told you to do something, but is because God put this in your life. And I think that's really where the gospel shines the most inside of work, is realizing that when work is an idol, you're sort of working for your soul. So every day you're there, you're like trying to earn it. You're trying to see if you can sort of get a soul and get content. When work is an inconvenience, you're working against your soul. Like every time you're there, every minute you're there, you're like grading against where you're finding your joy and your happiness and your fulfillment. But when you essentially have a settled soul or a settled heart in Jesus Christ because of what he's done on your behalf, you sort of have this new, we use the phrase humble confidence a lot, but you have this new security that shows up where you're able to work from your soul here. We're still able to, draw good lines and be able to not have work become this thing that forces you to be unfaithful in other areas of your life, but also to not be lazy and, not care and be a grumbler and a complainer all the time. You're there working from your soul because you're working for the Lord who saved you.
Yeah, and I think that, first of all, I just want to pause because that is like so helpful. I guess it's so helpful to consider the comparisons of how our soul relates to our work. I mean, it's just a really powerful concept. And I think that from there, as we think about applying working from our soul in our vocation, I think that also helps to even define the perimeters of what we can do for work and what we can't do as Christians, right? Because you can't work from your soul like as a prostitute, right?
Right.
Like that can't be your calling, because God has specifically forbidden that, right? You can't steal from your soul, right? And so there is and everything doesn't, have to, this isn't, everything has to have like a overtly Christian end. There's all sorts of different things, ways we can serve people, ways we can come alongside of them and serve them and care for them all sorts of different ways. But the things that we are doing as a vocation then fit in with the things that we can do from our souls.
Yeah, I think when you look at the idea that ultimately, in the end of verse 24, you are serving the Lord Christ, and you tie that to that idea of calling, that our work is a means of God providing for other people, you do get a sense that there are certain jobs that don't fit what a job is, what work is. It means that you can't serve the Lord because it's not providing. It's not the way God loves other people. It's not a way God provides for other people. It actually is a way that things are taken from other people. And so it becomes a fascinating way of evaluating there are some jobs that are inappropriate, but what's also really cool is that the reverse is true, that it really does validate a lot of jobs that people tend to think don't have a lot of meaning in them. So you kind of go like, oh, wow, I really wish I could go be, working like at an NGO and giving, homeless people food like every day. That would feel so much more meaningful than me here, doing data entry, for this supermarket. It's like, I feel like I'm not really doing anything meaningful here. But when you understand calling and you understand that you're working for the Lord Christ, you begin to see that what you're doing, even though you aren't chained to that job for the next, 40 years, what you're doing that day in that work is helping a grocery company get the job done of providing food for people when they need to eat. And that's a means of God feeding all flesh. Like you really are, no matter how indirect, caught up in a way of loving others and actually serving the Lord Jesus Christ, which is really cool for a lot of people.
So in that same vein, because when you're describing working from your soul rather than against or for your soul, I think there's a lot of people who would say, and maybe it's the data entry person for a grocery company or whatever it is, grocery store, grocery company. I guess there's a company too.
It's probably a company.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a company. A lot of people, I feel like a lot of people would say, I want to work from my soul, but I don't think my job allows that to happen for one reason or another. And it's not a moral thing like Scott was talking about earlier, where it's stealing from your soul or whatever. That there's a sense in which it's hard for people to see those connections. What would you say to someone in that situation that has a difficulty seeing the connection between either the greater good or this working from the soul and a job that maybe feels difficult for them to do or frustrating for them to do and they can't see the greater purpose of it?
It's interesting that before this section in Colossians 3, you go up to Colossians 1, and it says, set your eyes on the things above, on Christ, where your life is hidden in Christ and God. Like there's a sense of get your eyes off of things that are sort of temporal and look up to Jesus Christ, and that's where your real life is, your real identity is. That's where your home and your life is. And when you think about that passage, a lot of the time we think that looking up is a way of sort of getting out of the things that are around us. So there's sort of, I'm looking at all my circumstances, I really should be looking at Christ. And I would say that it actually, looking at Christ functions as a kind of lens that now grounds you in your circumstances. And so when we talk about working from the soul, we're saying you need to be looking at Christ in such a way that you're reminding yourself of what's actually true in a day-to-day that is where it's easy to lose that. And so as you look up at Christ and you're in the midst of suffering or difficulty or struggle, the goal is not to forget the suffering or struggle. The goal is to then look through the lens of where your life is and what Jesus has done for you and him as your ultimate identity, and then view those things from that different angle and perspective and walk through them in a godly way. I would say it's the exact same way with work. And so with these verses in Colossians 3 coming after Colossians 1, there's a way of looking at it that says, if you're in this sort of job where you feel like at best it's indirect the way you're helping people, and it's easy to forget that. I just feel it feels hard day to day to remember these things. Looking up at Jesus Christ is not a way to forget what you're doing. It's a way to constantly, Scott talks about cutting trails, to constantly cut the trail between what you're doing day to day and the ultimate reality that is, this is a means by which God actually does provide for people. You are providing a service.
Yeah, and I think that in that same way, that is what helps us to see calling in connection to and in connection with all the rest of the discipleship pathway, right? Mm-hmm. As we're regularly reading our Bible, as we're praying, as we're living in community with others who can remind us of this, it doesn't help us escape our calling. It doesn't get us away from our calling. It's not in contrast to our calling, but all of those things actually help us to fulfill our calling, help us to remember what's true about our various callings, and helps us to live them out, remembering the truth about them.
Yeah, and that's why I think when you get down to sort of the very practical things, the things that people tend to complain about at work, so meetings, office politics, things like that, what we're not saying is that when you understand work as a calling, those disappear, that sort of all your frustrations go away, and working from the soul means just constantly being very happy with how everything's going.
Skipping through your day.
Yeah, it's not this sort of escapist way of looking at your job. It's recognizing that, like Genesis 3 says, work is difficult after the fall. In a fallen world, you being a fallen person with fallen people around you that you're working with, and a fallen world that you're trying to sort of corral and provide these different services for people, whatever that looks like for you. It's acknowledging those things, but not losing sight of what God is still doing in a world he's redeeming, even through something that you might think is insignificant. You might think it's insignificant. You might think it's too indirect. You might not understand how putting something in an Excel spreadsheet or finding, making a deal for commercial real estate or something is actually helping. But God hasn't lost sight.
You always use Jonathan.
I like it. I like it. I think Jonathan is someone in commercial real estate, for those who are wondering.
He might be listening. And in that sense, then, being a Christian at work is more than just sharing the gospel with your coworkers. Mm-hmm. It's being a good worker in your calling.
Yeah, you become someone who understands that the work you put in on a day-to-day basis and a year-to-year basis is not just for a bonus and is not just as leverage to sort of talk about Jesus, though both those things are real. And in a sense, a bonus can be a wonderful blessing, and sharing the gospel is an amazing thing that we just finished talking about how important that is. But it's also a means of loving your neighbor as yourself. And so you work for the sake of loving other people through the job you have, whatever that job happens to be in the moment. And so as you go through these things, you find yourself being able to, I would say that one of the signs that you're understanding this is that even though you still get frustrated, you also, along with different frustrations, in your job, or this meeting seems useless, or the different sort of common thoughts that come up, in the midst of that, you also have in the same mind an understanding of how what you're doing makes some sort of difference. And I think that's why I like the real estate examples, though this isn't the side Jonathan works on. But the idea that, you can just sort of go around making deals for, here's some deal I'm making for someone to develop one more office park, and you just kind of go in and day out, and I got to fill out paperwork again for this thing, got to show some people this, and got to negotiate this. And you become the kind of person that looks for those stories that says, what business went into that park? And then be able to say, what service did they provide? Like, whose life is different because I put in time, my company put in time to connect a company with a place to be so they could provide their service. Like, how am I a part of this chain where it starts with God providing, runs through what we do through a lot of other people, and then people do get provided for and loved?
So we have been talking about and are talking about walking in the world, spreading and displaying God's glory in our lives, and that means walking in our callings and seeking to love others in our work. And here's what we've talked about in this session, how calling is part of spreading God's glory. We got an overview of what calling is, and we talked about how we can pursue our calling at work. And so here are some practical questions for you leaving this session. What makes it difficult for you to think of your roles and responsibilities as callings, and how can you overcome those obstacles? And secondly, what about your work do you struggle with the most? And what can you apply from this class, what we just talked about here in this session, to grow and cultivate God's calling? Thanks. We'll see you next time.